This is Get Real with Deb Waterbury, a show where Dr. Deb gets real as she teaches through books and studies on topics relevant for today. And now, here is your host, Dr. Deb Waterbury.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Get Real with Deb Waterbury. For this episode, we've been talking about the book I wrote some time ago called 6 Pairs of Sandals. And in that book, I talk about 6 women of the Bible and how those women did move in their particular giftings in what they did according to what the Bible records. And in that, then, I thought that each of us could find at least one of these women that we share characteristics with and then can move and figuratively step in her sandals to minister to one another in our churches, in our communities, in our groups. This is because all of us, everyone is a minister, and I know I've made that point before, but we often put that title minister as if that is someone who's paid by the church or they're put up in a teaching position. But the truth is that the minute you become saved, then every single person who has accepted Jesus as their Savior, once that happens, you are now a minister, and your role here is to point others to Christ through ministering to different people in different ways. It's best, however, if we understand what our gifts are, because otherwise you're ministering in places that you're not feeling qualified or feeling able, and then you get feeling dejected and feeling insecure about those things. So there are lots of tests out there, where you can figure out what your gifts are. Sometimes, however, it's really nice to be able to figure out maybe a person that you're a lot like that person and then move in their footsteps. And I just figured what better place to look than the examples that were given in the Bible. So we've talked about Deborah, we've talked about Elizabeth, we've talked about Lydia. So now this week, I want to talk about someone that maybe you're not as familiar with. You may be familiar with one of her names. She has 2 different names, a Greek name and a Jewish name. The Bible, depending on the translation that you're reading, will call her either Dorcas or Tabitha. So whichever one you're used to hearing, I'll probably refer to her more as Dorcas. Dorcas and Tabitha are the same person. And I call her the servant disciple. There's this popular comedian out right now, and he talks about how some people who are just not gifted and they're relegated to being chair stackers, and they just go over in the corner and stack some chairs. And, although we laugh at that, there are a lot of us who think that service then is so secondary and is so, menial that we put it over there and say, oh, just people who can't do anything do that stuff. And that couldn't be further from the truth. A servant disciple truly is the highest, in my opinion, and I believe in Jesus' opinion, of any of the giftings, of any of the people who minister in the Bible. And Dorcas or Tabitha was such a good example of that, and why. And so many of us, I think, need to stop thinking that you have to be a teacher, you have to be a small group leader, you got to be a singer, somehow or another you got to be up on stage doing something huge in order to have a position in ministry in the kingdom that is relevant. The truth, it couldn't be, as I said, anything be further from the truth. Think about what happened in Mark chapter 9, verses 33 through 35. And they came to Capernaum. Now, when I say they, I'm talking about the disciples and Jesus. And when he was in the house, Jesus, he asked his disciples, what were you discussing on the way? And a lot of you will remember this because you remember what they were talking about. But they kept silent because he'd caught them, right? So they were on the way to Capernaum. And they'd all been kind of chit-chatting, thinking that God didn't hear them. Jesus didn't hear them. So they were kept silent because he's saying, so what were you guys talking about? For on the way, they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And Jesus sat down and he called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. So Jesus himself lets us know how important this role is. It is the most important, being a servant disciple. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about Tabitha or Dorcas and what she did and why this is so important, what actually occurs. So the story of Dorcas is found in Acts chapter 9, right around verse 36 or so. I'm not going to really read all of that right now. We'll refer to some of that, but that's where we find this very short little vignette where we find out a little bit about this woman named Dorcas. Now, if you look at verse 36 there of chapter 9, it says, now they were in Joppa, and there was a disciple named Tabitha, which translated means Dorcas. So it's interesting that they call her a disciple. This is the very first and only time in the New Testament where there is a feminine usage of the word disciple, which is a huge honor. This woman is called a disciple in Joppa. Dorcas, Tabitha, was a disciple. First and only time that word disciple was used in its feminine use in the Greek. Dorcas, was one of those women who just wanted to serve, who served people. She was all about being the one who was wanting to serve others. But the most important thing about Dorcas, about Tabitha, was that she was a disciple first. Now, she'd already converted. There was that conversion to Christianity had already occurred, and there had been a huge revival in that area. And Dorcas, being called a disciple, was being called a follower after this. Now, the application for me in terms of that, if you are a Dorcas, if you see yourself as a servant disciple, is that you have to be a disciple. It's not just being a servant, it's being a servant disciple. Why is that so important? Why is it so important that we are discipling as we are a disciple first before we are a servant? Well, you know as well as I do, there are all kinds of philanthropic organizations out there right now, and they do good work. I'm not saying it's not, they're not helping people. But at the end of the day, let me just be blunt with you. If I feed someone and I don't do it in the name of Jesus, and I'm not a disciple of Jesus first, then I've fed them here in the immediate. But what have I done for their eternity? It's like putting a Band-Aid on a great big huge wound that's going to kill somebody, and I stick a Band-Aid on it and say, yeah, you'll be all right today. That's exactly what's happening if you're not a disciple first before you begin to serve, because you need to be serving in terms of eternity for the people that you are serving, and you have to know of whom you speak. And that's being a disciple. And so that's what Dorcas was and what Tabitha was. The second characteristic of Tabitha that I think it made her such a great example of the person who's a servant disciple is that she was a woman full of good works and full of charity. Verse 936, the second part of it says, she was full of good works and full of charity. So the word there that is used for her being one full of good works was actually a Greek word. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it for you, but it is where we get the words that now become our nonprofit organization. So basically, Dorcas ran the very first nonprofit organization ever, and that's the word used in Greek. She was full of those kinds of good works and full of charity towards other people. Now, in order to be someone that is going to step into this, being full of good works and full of charity, I think the question you have to ask yourself is, why do you do it? Because why did Dorcas do it? Which kind of goes back to being the disciple. Why, if you're doing something good for someone, or you're running a nonprofit organization, or you're full of charity and you see yourself as a person who does that, why do you do it? Do you do it for affirmation, or do you do it simply because you want to serve? There's a difference between, and it's really about attitude and about where your heart is. A third thing that I see about Dorcas is that she was a woman of action. So, some translations, the one I just read from did not, but some translations in that verse 36 there of chapter 9 in Acts add the words that she was full of good works and full of charity, and then they add the phrase, which she did. Now, I wish all the translations put that in there, because I wish I had a nickel for every single time somebody came to me with this grand idea about how they were going to start a nonprofit, or how they were going to do this thing, or do this good work for somebody, and then they don't do it. And understandable, because time gets in the way. Maybe that's really not your call. But in order to be a servant disciple, you can't just be thinking about what you want to do. You're so full of this need to serve that you do it. So Dorcas was full of, which means she had a heart for good works and for charity, which she then did. So it really is being a person of action. Are you willing to step out and do the things that might necessarily put you in some kind of bind, or even be something that would be not as convenient for you? Are you willing to be inconvenienced in your own life to take these ideas that you have and then become a person of action? Well, Tabitha obviously was, because the Bible very clearly says she's full of these things, wanted to do them, had a great heart for them, and then she did them. So I think that's a necessary looking at whether or not you have that characteristic. Are you willing to be that person? The fourth thing that I see about her is that she was dearly loved. Now, I don't necessarily think that means you got to be popular. That's not but the Bible very clearly says in verse 37 of Acts 9, in those days she became ill and she died. And when they had washed her, they laid her up in an upper room. Now, why do I see that as a person who is loved? It's, there was ceremonial washing that had to occur and preparation for burial as soon as a person died in that culture. But what they did was the unthinkable. Now, why would they do that? Well, I'll tell you why they did that. It's because they knew Peter was in town. Peter was there. And because Peter was there, these people loved her so much they couldn't stand the fact that she had died. Now, what she did was she made clothes and did things for people there in Joppa. And now it wasn't just what she did, it obviously had to be how much she was loved. These people did the unthinkable. This was truly against every single ceremonial thing to not get her ready for burial. But they didn't. They literally put her up in an upper room and left her there and then went to go find Peter. This woman was dearly loved, and she wasn't loved because of what she did. She was loved because of her heart for other people. She was loved because she loved first. The Bible's very clear about the fact that we love God because he loved us first. And I can tell you this right now, that people will not be able to love you if they don't feel that you also have love to give. And you know what? You can serve all you want to. And if you don't have a heart full of love towards the people you're serving, it really doesn't count for anything. And people won't even receive it, and they certainly don't care about it. But if obviously that was not the case with Dorcas, and she was so dearly loved that they did, as I said, the unthinkable and didn't get her ready for burial because they wanted Peter to come and do whatever he needed to do to bring this precious woman back to life, which he absolutely did. So my question then to you is, if you see yourself as a servant disciple, do you truly love those to whom you want to serve? Because if you don't, then you need to check it. You might be all about being affirmed. You might be all about just getting some credit. But those acts and those services need to be born of a true love for those that you serve. And finally, the very last characteristic of Dorcas that I find so beautiful is that she had a life of revival. Like I said, Peter came, and this is one of the biggest miracles that were actually first recorded in the Bible when Peter was doing his own thing after preaching that sermon at Pentecost. When he goes and literally, basically, he just said, "Rise, Dorcas, rise," and she stood up and came back to life and started serving everybody again. So this was a huge thing. But what happened, and the Bible records this in verse 42 of chapter 9, and it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. She couldn't have known. There's no way Tabitha could have known that simply just making some clothes for some poor people and then loving them as she served them was going to turn hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of people to Christ. She didn't know that. She was just serving out of love. But in her death, in that revival came because of her death, because of her love. Now, it came because of the miracle, but the miracle only had any kind of force because these people loved her so much that they waited and tried to get Peter up there. And her life, because of that love for her and the love she gave, and then Peter's miracle, look at what happened in Joppa. So, there's that word legacy is thrown around a lot these days about what kind of legacy are you going to leave, or how will people remember you? Well, the truth is, if they don't remember you for how you were instrumental in possibly pointing them toward Christ or showing them the love of Christ, then again, you've put a Band-Aid on a mortal wound. Instead of curing that wound or being the facilitator of that cure, which is a wound that will either precipitate eternity or in heaven or eternity in hell. So if your legacy doesn't do something to that nature, then your legacy doesn't really count, I would imagine, because a legacy is only as far as, in my opinion, eternity. And what are you doing for that? All those things, you can see where I just had a conversation with a woman the other day. It's difficult to measure small acts and think that they have eternal consequences. But I was just talking to a lady the other day who was thinking that she was inadequate. And then as we talked, she remembered having spoken to a person at one time while this person was in a low place, and she'd only been a Christian for a couple of weeks. But he came to her and she invited him to church. Now, and that was all. She just invited him to church, told him about what Jesus had done in her life, and invited him to church. That man is now an evangelist and is traveling all over the world and is bringing thousands of souls to Christ. Now, who's going to be standing in line to thank her in heaven? Well, it's going to be every single person that man brought to Christ because she did one simple act of service. We have to stop measuring what is most important in kingdom building by what is visual or what is big. The entire Pauline church was built in the New Testament. The entire church built in the New Testament by one person talking to another person, one person serving another person, and then home churches were built all over. And from those home churches, we have the church today. Literally today is started just with one person talking to another person, one person serving another person. Tabitha making clothes for the poor. And a church was born in Joppa. So never underestimate your gift of service. But again, be sure that your gift of service is one that's really born of a love for your fellow men and women in Christ, or in just the world in general. You want them to have eternity. So thank you so much for being with me today. We're going to get into some more ladies in the next couple of weeks. Remember that you can get all these messages are here on iTunes as well. You need to subscribe. Please remember to subscribe. And if you want to buy 6 pairs of sandals, you can do that on Amazon, or you can go to debwaterbury.com and buy them there. And there's more information in the book than I'm giving you, obviously. So you can do that if you want. In the meantime, God bless. Thank you for joining me today on this episode of Get Real with Deb Waterbury. I hope you were blessed, and I hope you got some information that's going to help you get through your day. If you want any more information on any of my books or my articles or on any of my future speaking engagements, you can find all that information at debwaterbury.com. God bless you.